Millions of people grew up with The Cosby Show. To them, the Huxtables were the perfect American family. But behind those scripted laughs and picture-perfect dinners, there were real people forming bonds, clashing, supporting one another, and carrying secrets that fans never really knew. Before Malcolm-Jamal Warner faced some of the darkest chapters of his life, there was an untold story between Phylicia Rashad and Tempestt Bledsoe, two women who share more than TV set. They shared a complex relationship that shaped the way they carried themselves through the storm. In 1984, American television was standing at a crossroads. The images that had dominated the small screen for decades painted narrow portraits of what family life was supposed to look like. Black families, when they were shown at all, were often trapped in stereotypes, poor, struggling, or absent from the mainstream altogether. The airwaves were filled with shows that didn't reflect the growing complexity of American households, and in many ways, television was overdue for a revolution. That revolution arrived quietly at first, but it would erupt into a cultural phenomenon known around the world as The Cosby Show. From the very first episode, something felt different. Viewers were introduced to the Huxtables, a black family living not in poverty or chaos, but in a beautiful Brooklyn brownstone, raising 5 children in a home filled with love, discipline, and laughter. This wasn't the narrative America was used to seeing. Here was a father who was a doctor, a mother who was a lawyer, children who dreamed, fought, stumbled, and grew just like any other children in middle-class America. It was aspirational, yet it felt authentic, and for millions of viewers tuning in every Thursday night, it was like watching a mirror that had never existed before. And at the heart of this transformation was Phylicia Rashad, cast as Clair Huxtable. She was not just a mother on the show. She became the blueprint of elegance and authority. With her sharp wit, calm presence, and unwavering dignity, she wasn't written to be the tired, nagging mom television often served up. Instead, she was the equal partner to her husband, intelligent, assertive, and loving. She represented a new vision of black womanhood on television, polished yet warm, sophisticated yet relatable. For young women watching at home, Clair Huxtable became a role model, showing that strength and grace could exist in the same breath. Beside her, growing up in real time before the eyes of the world, was Tempestt Bledsoe, who stepped into the role of Vanessa Huxtable, the 4th child of the family. Vanessa was awkward, funny, sometimes mischievous, often caught between the innocence of childhood and confusion of teenage years. She felt real to so many viewers because she carried the same frustrations, insecurities, and triumphs that everyday teenagers faced. She whined about rules, got caught up in peer pressure, and stumbled her way toward adulthood, all under the sharp but loving gaze of Clair. On screen, the chemistry between Phylicia and Tempestt was undeniable. They laughed together, argued, and shared tender moments that convinced millions of fans that their bond was just as strong when the cameras weren't rolling. But what the audience never saw was how layered that relationship really was. Off camera, Phylicia wasn't simply the mother figure who doted on her younger co-stars. She carried herself with a kind of seriousness that came from her theater background, from years of carving out a career in an industry that rarely allowed black women to shine. To her, professionalism wasn't optional, it was survival. And for Tempestt, who was still just a teenager navigating sudden fame, that level of intensity could feel both inspiring and intimidating. Behind the scenes, their connection wasn't always the warm, effortless love story that played out in the Huxtable household. It was complicated, a mixture of admiration and pressure, closeness and distance, lessons delivered sometimes with tenderness, sometimes with sharp edges. For the millions of families watching at home, none of that mattered. What they saw on Thursday nights was a vision of family that transcended race and class, a vision that pulled in record-breaking numbers of viewers and rewrote television history. The Huxtables were the family people wanted to belong to, and for children growing up in front of their televisions, Vanessa and Clair were more than characters. They were reflections of what it meant to be a daughter, what it meant to be a mother, what it meant to grow and to guide. And yet, just outside the glow of the studio lights, the real story between Phylicia and Tempestt was far less simple, filled with struggles that the audience could never imagine, struggles that would shape their lives in ways even they didn't fully see at the time. Phylicia Rashad didn't just play Clair Huxtable. She became her on and off the set, To the public eye, she was elegance personified, the lawyer wife who sparred with Cliff Huxtable's antics yet held her household together with grace and authority. But within the walls of the studio, her presence went far beyond reciting lines or hitting marks. Cast members often spoke of how she carried herself with a dignity that was impossible to ignore. She walked onto set like a queen of quiet power, not arrogant, not distant, but commanding in a way that made everyone else straighten their posture just a little. She was, in many ways, the matriarch not just of the Huxtables, but of the entire production. Yet, what fans never saw was the weight of that role. Phylicia came from the world of theater, trained with a discipline that had been hammered into her long before Hollywood ever opened its doors. To her, acting was not play, it was craft. It was duty. And with that conviction came an unspoken demand that everyone around her rise to the occasion. She expected the young actors, even the teenagers, to treat the work with seriousness. She believed they owed it to themselves, to the show, and to the larger story they were representing on television. For Phylicia, the responsibility of portraying a successful black family on screen wasn't casual entertainment. It was a cultural calling. This was where the tension sometimes bubbled between her and Tempestt Bledsoe. Tempestt was only a teenager when she stepped into the limelight. She was funny, bright, and natural in front of the camera, but she was still just a young girl, trying to navigate Hollywood while carrying the weight of America's gaze. To her, Phylicia's standards could sometimes feel intimidating. There were moments when the warmth of their mother-daughter bond blurred with the strictness of Phylicia's expectations. If Tempestt slipped into teenage playfulness or struggled with focus during long hours, Phylicia would gently, but firmly, pull her back into line. Some may have called it clashes, but it was more layered than that. Phylicia wasn't harsh to tear her down. She was protective in her own way. She saw herself as a guardian, not only of the show's legacy, but of the young cast members who might not yet understand the stakes of their visibility. The world was watching, and Phylicia knew that everything mattered. Every scene, every line, every moment they portrayed as the Huxtables. She carried that weight so the younger ones wouldn't have to, but she also wanted them to know this was bigger than just a TV show. The irony is that while fans at home adored the softness and patience of Clair Huxtable, those who worked closest to Phylicia saw the steel that made that softness possible. They saw the discipline behind the smile, the high expectations behind the laugh. To Tempestt, it may have felt overwhelming at times, but looking back, many understood that Phylicia's strictness was an act of care. She wanted to prepare her younger co-stars for an industry that would not always treat them kindly. She wanted them to value themselves, to know their craft, and to carry the same dignity she carried everywhere she went. That's the untold story of Phylicia Rashad. She wasn't just a television mother who happened to fall into the role. She chose to embody it, to live it, and to extend it beyond the cameras. And though that sometimes meant friction, especially with Tempestt, it also meant that she left behind not just a performance, but a legacy of guidance, one that shaped everyone who passed through her orbit. Tempestt Bledsoe's experience on The Cosby Show was as much about personal survival as it was about playing Vanessa Huxtable. Unlike Sherman Hemsley or Isabel Sanford, who walked onto the Jeffersons already knowing the stage, Tempestt was a child, still forming her sense of self, thrown into an industry that could be merciless. She was not just Vanessa, the fictional daughter in a scripted family. She was Tempestt, a teenager whose every move, every change in her body, every crack in her voice was scrutinized by millions of viewers. For many young stars, growing up on television means losing the freedom to experiment with identity in private. For Tempestt, it meant being picked apart by critics and fans who judged her looks, her weight, even the way she spoke. She became a public figure before she even had the chance to truly discover who she was as a person. Imagine being 13, awkward, and trying to navigate adolescence, while the entire country debates whether you're pretty enough or talented enough to belong on primetime television. That kind of spotlight leaves marks, and Tempestt carried them quietly. This is where her relationship with Phylicia Rashad became so layered. On one hand, Phylicia was the presence she could turn to when the pressure grew heavy. Phylicia had been through theater, rejection, and the tough grind of proving herself as a black actress in America. She had wisdom to share, and Tempestt sometimes leaned on her in those moments when Hollywood made her feel small. Phylicia's discipline and confidence were something Tempestt admired, even when she couldn't quite measure up to them. But the bond wasn't always simple. Phylicia carried herself with a dignity that demanded respect. She wasn't afraid to point out mistakes, to push the younger actors to do better, to tell them to sit straighter, speak clearer, and never forget that the Huxtables were meant to represent a flawless, aspirational family. To an adult, that might feel like mentorship, but to a teenager like Tempestt, it sometimes felt like judgment. The perfection that Phylicia embodied could be inspiring, but it could also be suffocating. Fans saw Vanessa roll her eyes at her TV mother and thought it was just acting. What they didn't realize was that behind the cameras, the dynamic wasn't all that different. Phylicia could be warm and nurturing, but she could also be unyielding. And for a young girl wrestling with her own insecurities, it sometimes felt like she was being measured against an impossible standard. Yet beneath all that tension was something real, a bond that mirrored the very relationship they portrayed on screen. Tempestt was a daughter trying to find her voice, her identity, her independence, while Phylicia was a mother figure who loved her enough to demand the best, even if it made her unpopular in the moment. It was complicated, yes, but it was also authentic. What most fans never realize is that this complexity shaped Tempestt in ways that lasted long after the cameras stopped rolling. She didn't always have the easiest time loving herself under the glare of fame, but the lessons, sometimes hard, sometimes comforting, that she absorbed from Phylicia stayed with her. Their dynamic was a reflection of something deeper than television. The real-life struggles of a young woman trying to grow into herself while living in America's so-called perfect black family, where imperfection wasn't supposed to exist. Malcolm-Jamal Warner's presence on The Cosby Show added another quiet layer to the story of Phylicia and Tempestt. On screen, he was Theo Huxtable, the only son, cool enough to stumble through adolescence while still being endearing. Off-screen, he carried something deeper, a sense of responsibility that wasn't written into any script. He was only a teenager himself, yet the weight of being in America's living room every week forced him to grow up quickly. For Tempestt, Malcolm was more than just a co-star. He was the one closest to her in age, the one who understood the awkwardness of going through puberty under glaring studio lights. While critics judged her, teased her, and sometimes broke her confidence, Malcolm was often the one to stand beside her, to reassure her, to remind her she belonged. He wasn't always loud about it, but his quiet loyalty mattered. In moments when Phylicia's discipline felt heavy, Malcolm became the buffer, her ally in the hallways of set, the voice whispering encouragement when the pressure of perfection grew unbearable. Phylicia, however, looked at Malcolm through a different lens. To her, he wasn't just Theo, and he wasn't just Tempest's friend. He was a young black man on one of the biggest shows in television history. That meant something. It meant responsibility. She expected him to carry himself with dignity, to act like an example not just for Tempestt, but for every young black boy watching. To Phylicia, Malcolm had the potential to set a standard, to rise above the stereotypes Hollywood was so eager to place on black men. And she pushed him, sometimes hard, to step into that role. This created a triangular dynamic that most fans never noticed. On one side, Phylicia was a stern protector, the matriarch, determined to guard both the show's image and the young cast's futures. On another side, Tempestt was a teenager caught in the middle of her own insecurities, balancing gratitude for the guidance with the frustration of being judged. And then there was Malcolm, the bridge between them, absorbing pressure from both ends. He had to be the role model Phylicia wanted him to be, while also being the friend Tempestt needed him to be. That kind of balance wasn't easy for a boy still trying to figure out who he was himself. The irony is that in later years, long after the camera stopped rolling, Malcolm's life would face tragedies of its own, failed relationships that left him scarred, the devastating loss of friends, and the roller coaster ride of career where Hollywood didn't always open its doors as easily as people assumed. He carried wounds that the audience never saw, just as Tempestt carried insecurities that the tabloids never truly understood. Looking back, those small behind-the-scenes tensions, the clashes, the protection, the moments of quiet loyalty weren't just about the making of a television show. They were reflections of how fragile and human the so-called perfect family really was. The Huxtables were written to be untouchable, flawless, aspirational. But in real life, the people playing them were young, vulnerable, and sometimes hurting. Malcolm, standing between Phylicia and Tempestt, embodied that truth. He wasn't just Theo Huxtable, the boy with a mischievous grin. He was a young man learning, stumbling, and carrying far more responsibility than most teenagers ever should. And in that triangle of discipline, struggle, and loyalty, we catch a glimpse of the real story, the untold one, that made the family on the Cosby Show both iconic and deeply human. The untold story of Phylicia and Tempest's relationship was never about open affection or constant warmth. It was about something more complicated, something that audiences could sense but never quite name. To the millions watching the Cosby Show, they looked inseparable. Clair and Vanessa Huxtable played out the universal dance of mother and daughter with humor, tenderness, and discipline. A relationship so real that fans swore they must have been just as close off screen. But the truth was far more layered. Behind the laughter, their connection was not one of daily hugs and easy comfort, but one of boundaries. Phylicia carried herself like a queen even when the cameras were off. A woman who had come through years of theater, personal struggles, and professional battles with her dignity intact. She respected Tempestt deeply. She saw her intelligence, her spark, her potential, but she worried that the young actress didn't always treat her gift with the seriousness it deserved. In Phylicia's eyes, talent was sacred, and the responsibility of representation even more so. She wanted Tempestt to understand that every scene was more than just a script. It was a statement, a chance to break stereotypes, a chance to rise above the narrow roles Hollywood carved out for young black women. For Tempestt, though, those expectations could feel suffocating. She admired Phylicia immensely. She saw in her a figure of grace, a woman she wanted to emulate in many ways. Yet at the same time, she was still a teenager, still learning to be comfortable in her own skin, still finding her voice in an industry that scrutinized her body, her hair, even her laugh. To be beside someone like Phylicia, who carried herself with such unshakable authority, was inspiring but also intimidating. It meant that sometimes, rather than feeling like she had a second mother on set, Tempestt felt like she was under constant evaluation. And yet, when the cameras rolled, something extraordinary happened. The tension melted into magic. The same discipline that sometimes felt overwhelming off-screen gave their on-screen relationship its sharpness and its heart. The admiration Tempestt had for Phylicia, mixed with her fear of disappointing her, translated into the nervous, earnest energy that made Vanessa's relationship with her mother feel so believable. And Phylicia's pride in Tempestt, though often unspoken, gave her portrayal of Claire Huxtable a depth that fans instinctively recognized as real. What the audience never knew was that their relationship was built not on constant affection, but on quiet lessons. Phylicia didn't coddle Tempestt. She shaped her. She didn't give her easy praise. She gave her standards. And though it sometimes created distance, it also planted seeds. Tempestt carried those lessons with her long after the show ended, into her adulthood, into her career, and even into the way she spoke about her experiences years later. The bond between them was never about being inseparable. It was about the respect that survived the distance. That was the untold story. It wasn't a fairy tale of off-screen hugs and motherly doting. It was something more enduring, forged in tension and respect, built on the idea that even without constant affection, influence can shape a life forever. The chemistry on screen was undeniable because beneath everything, beneath the boundaries, the intimidation, the high expectations, there was genuine respect, and that respect lasted far longer than the applause. Malcolm-Jamal Warner's story now carries a heartbreaking weight that no one could predict it when he was the bright-eyed Theo Huxtable on The Cosby Show. Back then, he was a bridge, protective of Tempestt, respectful of Phylicia, learning from both even as he tried to carve out his own place in the shadow of Bill Cosby's towering presence. He was a young man who laughed easily, who always seemed grounded, and who quietly shouldered the role of being a model black son on American television. As Malcolm grew older, he faced heartbreaks that reminded fans he was not just Theo, the funny, struggling teenager who made us all laugh. He was a man navigating failed relationships, the loss of friends, and moments where Hollywood seemed to turn its back on him. He had been typecast, doubted, Sometimes overlooked, yet he kept working, directing, performing, finding his voice in poetry and music. Through it all, he carried with him the lessons from those years with Phylicia and Tempestt. He knew what it meant to be disciplined because Phylicia had demanded it. He knew what it meant to be protective because he had done it instinctively for Tempestt. That triangular bond, part tension, part guidance, part unspoken love, became a kind of quiet preparation for the storms none of them knew were coming. And then, the unthinkable happened. On July 23rd, 2025, news broke that Malcolm-Jamal Warner had died in Costa Rica. He was just 54 years old. The report stunned fans across the world. The forensic pathology department confirmed the cause of death was accidental asphyxiation by submersion. He had been caught in a rip current while at Cockles Beach in Limon. 2 surfers nearby survived, but Malcolm didn't make it back to shore. The man who had once been America's son, who grew up before our eyes, was gone. It was a kind of tragedy that made fans pause, not just because of the shock, but because of what Malcolm represented. For so many, he wasn't just a TV character. He was family. He was a boy who made mistakes, who struggled with school, who dreamed of more, and who, in many ways, mirrored the lives of millions of young black men. His loss hit with the same intimacy as losing a cousin, a brother, a lifelong friend. And in that grief, people began to look back at the untold story of those years on the Cosby Show. The tension between Phylicia and Tempestt, the lessons Malcolm absorbed in silence, the way the 3 of them balanced one another. Suddenly, it all felt like a prologue to this painful chapter. It wasn't just a sitcom family anymore. It was a reminder that even in the glow of fame, real life was waiting with its share of heartbreaks. Phylicia had prepared them with her strictness. Tempestt had endured under pressure, finding her voice. And Malcolm had learned from both what it meant to keep standing, even when the world wasn't kind. In the end, their story wasn't just about perfection of the Huxtable household. It was about 3 people navigating respect, distance, discipline, and affection in ways that shaped them long after the cameras stopped. Malcolm's death forces the story into focus. The untold story between Phylicia and Tempestt was never just about the 2 of them. It was about how that complicated bond, forged under the weight of expectation, also left a mark on Malcolm. It prepared him, and in a way, prepared fans too, for the truth that even the perfect family was made of flesh and blood, vulnerable to tragedy. And now, as reruns continue to play, the laughter they share feels more fragile and more precious, because we know how the story truly ended. The Huxtables were America's family, but behind the laughter, there were lessons about discipline, identity, respect, and survival. Phylicia, Rashad, and Tempestt Bledsoe didn't always see eye to eye, but their untold story is one of growth, resilience, and a kind of love that wasn't always soft, but was always present. And when Malcolm-Jamal Warner faced tragedy later in life, the strength of that foundation, however complicated, was part of what carried him through.